functional levels, and the Active Directory migration tool. In this nugget, we cover a few basic topics relating to functional levels and migration. Now, the reason why I'm really addressing functional levels is because they work directly into the Active Directory migration tool. You need to understand something about the functional levels in order to perform a proper migration. For example, admt, or the Active Directory migration tool, may call for Windows 2008 over Windows Server 2003 domain functional levels. So I'll talk about all the various domain functional levels that are available. I'll also talk about the forest functional levels as well. And then finally, we'll conclude with the discussion and a demonstration of the Active Directory migration tool, which you can use to migrate accounts from Windows 2000, Windows NT, or other Windows Server 2003 domains. Now, as you prepare to upgrade from Windows NT4 to Windows Server 2003, or if you prepare to upgrade from Windows 2000 to Windows Server 2003, which is nowhere near as drastic, but which still has some implications that you have to keep in mind, be aware of certain key things such as domain functional level, or DFL, and forest functional level, or FFL. Now, the DFL and FFL will dictate how much flexibility you have within your domain, how many features you can take advantage of that are already built into Windows Server 2003, but which might otherwise be handicapped by the presence of older operating systems, such as, in worst case scenario, NT4 domains. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these different things. Here we're going to, first of all, take a look at domain functional levels. And with this, we've got Windows 2000 Mixed DFL. Now, Windows 2000 Mixed DFL gives me the ability to use all of these kinds of domain controllers. The big disadvantage with this one, however, is that I will still have some limitations of NT4 and Windows 2000. Now, with this Mixed DFL, I do get the ability to install a domain controller from backup, which is new compared to Windows 2000 and NT4, because in those operating systems, I might have a headquarters and a satellite office separated by a slow 56K WAN link. And when I try to install a domain controller in that satellite office, it's got to download maybe hundreds of megabytes across that slow WAN link. Might really cause some problems in terms of that upgrade, in terms of its timeliness and reliability, and being able to pull all that data across that slow link. Well, now I can use NT Backup to back up the system state data, restore it to a local server on my satellite office that I'm going to promote to a domain controller, and then using DC promo space /ADV, I will get the ability to use the locally restored data as my source for Active Directory. So that way it has the whole glob of data locally there, and it doesn't have to take it all across the slow WAN link. And all it has to download then from that WAN link will be any updated information. Then we have application directory partitions, which allows me to discretely store certain bits of information that only get replicated around to certain kinds of domain controllers. And we already have two of those application directory partitions, domain DNS zones and forest DNS zones, which gives me the ability to control how much DNS data gets replicated throughout my Active Directory, and I can also add additional application directory partitions for custom purposes. I also have the ability to save my queries if I want to search against a certain kind of user account or a certain attribute in Active Directory, for example, in Active Directory users and computers. I now have saved queries that I can work with there, so I can always just go back to that query and refresh it to get any updated information. And then I have the ability to use 300 sites. This is really an issue with Windows 2000. That's not really a feature, that's really a limitation. Because in Windows 2000, you couldn't use as many sites as you can now in further, more advanced levels of Windows Server 2003. And this is only a big issue with large organizations. Now, there's another disadvantage here. Really, the practical limitation is only about 100 or less sites, because the inter-site topology generator has to perform certain calculations periodically. And if you have too many sites, over 100 or more, then it really pegs the CPU utilization, and those domain controllers performing those calculations will pretty much be unavailable for a while. And that's because the algorithm that's used to perform these calculations is not that efficient. So again, this is kind of theoretical. No one wants to use 300 sites in Windows 2000. Now, we kind of discussed this, at least by implication, in a previous nugget in this series, and that is Windows Server 2003 Interim DFL, and that assumes that we have only NT4 and Windows Server 2003 domain controllers. This will give us all the same features of Windows 2000 Mixed DFL, which we just looked at, plus we'll get one other feature, and that is the ability to have more than 5,000 in-group membership. And again, that's because Windows 2000 has the limitation that it can only go up to 5,000, but some very large organizations needed more than 5,000 in their group membership, so when they upgraded to Windows 2000, they had to split up their groups. Well, now in Windows Server 2003, we've gone back to the ability to keep 5,000 or more in group membership. And then as we move up to Windows 2000 native DFL, we can have only Windows 2000 or Windows Server 2003 domain controllers. And this gives us all of the features of Windows 2000 mixed DFL, plus we get all these additional features such as universal security groups. And in the past, in Windows 2000 or Windows Server 2003, you could use universal security groups, but only as distribution groups for use with email programs such as Microsoft Exchange. To make universal security groups would be a whole other matter, and it's only available starting with Windows 2000 native, and then after this you can also use it in Windows Server 2003 domain functional level, which we'll cover shortly here. We also have the ability to do full group nesting, and this is certainly something you want to be aware of. Now, to really illustrate that, let's go back to an NT4 computer, which is a domain controller for cbtnuggets.com, where I've got a couple of user accounts here. I've got a global group here, a couple of local groups that you see here as well. Now, these user accounts are nested inside of the global group that you see here, and that's common practice in Windows NT4. Users go into global groups. Then normally you'll take your global groups and nest them inside of your local group, which we can see going on right here. Now, what we can't do in NT4 is full group nesting. That means that I cannot take a global group and nest it inside of another global group. So, for example, I could not nest it inside of global 02, for example. So that if I go to global 02 and I try to add in CBT global over here, they don't even appear in the list. There's no way to add them into the list. It just can't be done. Same thing with local groups. No, typically, again, local groups will have nested inside of them global groups. But if I try to add another local group here, for example, CBT local 02, then if I look for it, I'm not going to be able to find it. The interface doesn't even give me the ability to do that. You just plain can't do it. So we're limited in the kind of nesting we can do in Windows NT4. Only thing you can do, global groups go into local groups. And that's pretty much it. Now, on the other hand, let's take a look at what we can do with full group nesting when we get to Windows 2000 native domain functional level here. You can take universal groups, and that's what the U here is, universal groups, and nest them inside of other universal groups in any domain in the forest. Universal groups can also be nested inside of any domain local group in any domain in the forest. Global groups can be nested inside of universal groups, domain local groups, and other global groups as long as they are in the same domain here. Domain local groups can only be nested inside of other domain local groups, again, within the same domain. What you cannot do is to nest universal groups into any global group. And this, in a nutshell, is kind of what we get with the full group nesting that I talked about on the previous whiteboard here. We also get the ability to perform group conversions. So if I started off with a universal group and I want to make it a domain local group, I can do that. If I have a domain local group, I want to switch it to a universal group, I can do that as well. So we can switch all of those group memberships around. We also have policy-based remote access service. And really, in Windows 2000 and 2003, it's called RAS, or Routing and Remote Access Service. I just still call it RAS out of habit, I guess, from NT4. But in any case, this gives us dozens, if not hundreds, of various options to configure through routing and remote access policies, the ability to control remote access connections. And these features were not available at all with NT4. That's why we can't have NT4 in the operating systems for our domain controllers if we're going to be able to use policy-based RAS. And then we will also have the ability then to use something called SID history. And in brief, let's take a look at what that is. Here I've got a domain controller, and I've got a user account down here with a specific SID. And the SID might be S-1-5-21, and they all start with that. And then, something else, 1, 2, 3, something like that. And then it goes on from there. And that makes that unique within that domain. And in the same domain, we may have a file server over here where this user with their appropriate SID has access to a specific folder over here. And so they're able to gain access to that. Now, what happens is if I'm going to go ahead and now install another domain, maybe it's going to be my Windows Server 2003 domain over here in a different domain, but I want to have this user account migrated into this domain, then what can happen is I can do that. I can use a tool called Active Directory Migration Tool. And that'll bring over this user account over into this domain. Now what's going to happen is they're going to generate a new SID, S-1-5-21-, let's make this, 910, something like that. That's their new SID over here. Now, in addition to that, they will have their SID history. That means that it's not only going to give them their new SID, but it's going to retain their old SID as well, and that will also get migrated up here into this new domain. That way, when my user attempts to access their old resource for which they had access because of their SID being in the ACL on this resource, they will still be able to access that resource even when they have a new account over here. This is very important in things such as migrations, where we want to maybe consolidate domains. We wanted to use Active Directory Migration Tool, which we'll talk about in more detail later here, which to take all our users, all our groups, our computer accounts, and move them over into a new domain, while at the same time allowing them to have resource access to this member server in the old domain. And we want to be able to do that in a gradual process where eventually maybe we'll change the ACL over here to only the new SID. And then maybe we would even want to get rid of the SID history attribute, which is just an Active Directory attribute, in the new domain. And that might be useful because there is a slight security vulnerability there where a dishonest administrator could assume the identity of someone else by modifying the administrator's own SID history, and they could pretend to be some other user down here when they're really their own administrator account, and then illegitimately gain access to this resource over here. Now, if you had the ability to use SID history like you do in Windows 2000 Native, but you didn't really need it, you might consider enabling SID filtering, which is just another way of saying turning off the ability to use the SID history so we're not able to migrate over these old SIDs into the new domain. Now, just FYI, if you want to know more details about SID filtering, then you can go to this article and you can just on your own pause the recording and jot down this URL up here in my browser up there. Then you can learn more about SID history and SID filtering. And the article was written for Windows 2000, but it still applies to Windows Server 2003. Now, finally, of course, you get the best feature set when you're at Windows Server 2003 domain functional level, which means you have only Windows Server 2003 domain controllers in that domain. And this gives you all the features of Windows 2000 native DFL, plus you get up to 3,000 sites. Wow, imagine that. Whereas in previous version, well, actually just Windows 2000, where we had a limitation, a practical limitation of about 100 sites, and a theoretical limitation of about 300, it really was not practical past 100 because of the calculations required in the ISTG, or the Inner Site Topology Generator. It would kind of peg the CPU utilization every time a recalculation had to take place. Well, now with the spanning tree algorithm, with Windows Server 2003 DFL, we have a better algorithm there that can give us the ability to use more sites without hitting the processor utilization that hard. Also, we get a logon timestamp with our accounts now, and that will give us the ability then to use Active Directory users and computers to search against user accounts, perhaps in a specific organizational unit or in the whole domain if you want, for any accounts that are stale or that are old or that are employees that have long since left the company. Might be handy also on something like a college campus where you haven't had a student there for 2 years and yet they still have an old account there. Well, you can look for any accounts that have not been logged on with in the last 30 days, 90 days, whatever you want it to be. And then you can get rid of those accounts. And we also have an inet.org person user password attribute that's useful for migrating or interoperability with other LDAP services. And we also have the ability to rename the domain controller. Now, you must take great care when you do this, and there may be a period of a time where the domain controller is unavailable, so that's best done on weekends or during times where you're not using peak utilization. But it's really pretty simple. You just rename your domain controller. That rename will take place across the rest of the domain, and then you'll be back in business as soon as replication is all finished there. And we also have Authorization Manager. This gives us simply the ability. It's kind of more of a programmatic thing. There's no interface or nothing you click on to do this. It's really something where you can use programming such as JScript, VBScript, some other kind of things like that to be able to get fine-grained control over what can be done within an application so that, for example, within the application, you might have one user that has full control over it, another user that has some limited level of control over it because of Authorization Manager capabilities. And then there's also constrained delegation. And this gives us the ability to have one computer have delegated control over another computer, but only in certain respects. We might be able to have one computer start a specific service on another computer, for example, and that's all we want it to do. Well, again, that's more fine-grained control than what we've had in the past. Now, let's go ahead and skip this selective cross-forest authentication. Let me talk about the transitive forest trust and then come back to that. The transitive forest trust simply gives me the ability to trust completely throughout two forests. So, for example, in Windows 2000, if I had a forest here, maybe a child domain here, child domain over here, then they were created separately, and they don't really have any trust relationship with one another except for if I create old NT4 style two one-way trusts. So I'd create a trust this way, create a trust that way. Now, just because these two domains now trust each other doesn't mean that this domain also trusts this domain transitively. So in Windows Server 2003, when you create that trust relationship between these two domains, and as long as you're Windows Server 2003 DFL, and by the way, as long as you've also upgraded the Forest to Windows Server 2003 Forest functional level, then you have the ability to do this. Now all I have to do is to get these two domains to trust each other, and then they will transitively trust all their respective child domains as well. Now that we have an understanding of that, let's go back to another item here, and that is the selective cross-forest authentication. Maybe we do have this trust relationship, but we're not really part of the same company. It's not like we're a subsidiary of one another. Maybe this domain over here is just part of a partnership company where we have some subcontractors over there that work for us. Well, we don't want them to access everything in this little child domain over here, and where we've got, a file server or something like that. So even though we set up this cross-forest transitive trust here, maybe we want more fine-grained control than that. We don't want them to be able to authenticate against any server in any of these domains. Maybe we only want them to authenticate against this one file server down here. Well, that's what selective cross-forest authentication will give for us. And then we can also use something called reader user and reader computer. And what these will do is, instead of having new accounts automatically go into the user's container or the computer's container for computers, respectively, then we can use these two simple command line commands to redirect them to the organizational unit of our choosing. And that way I can dump new users, new computers into highly locked down organizational units by policies until I can figure out their appropriate location to go. And that way I don't accidentally create renegade users or computers that are not subject to any restrictive policies. Now, as we move on to Forest functional levels, we start off first with Windows 2000 FFL, which is the default. That's what you're going to have as soon as you install your first Windows Server 2003 domain controller at the root of the Forest. And that gives us the ability to have NT4 2000 or 2003 domain controllers. And then this is what gives us that ability to install a domain controller from a backup. So some of your DFL levels and features are subject to whatever you get in the Forest functional level here. This is also where we get our application directory partitions and our limited group membership, and that's not really an issue with the Forest functional level so much as it is the fact that I've got Windows 2000 domain controllers that, again, cannot have large group membership. Now, if possible, of course, if I have only Windows NT4 domain controllers and Windows Server 2003, then I should change my Forest functional level to Windows Server 2003 interim Forest functional level, and that gives me all the features of Windows 2000 FFL plus linked value replication, and that relates to group membership, so that if I've got, say, 5,000 members of this group right here, and I have a new employee here, and I add this one member to that new group, then on another domain controller, when replication takes place, it doesn't just replicate this one new employee to this group over here where I've already got another copy of it. Instead, what it does is it replicates all 5,000 plus that one employee again. So it would be much more efficient with linked value replication, which we have with this interim functional level, so that it will just retain its existing membership. It kind of remembers how many people are already there. Plus, it only now takes the changes. It only takes this one individual user and replicates that to that one user account over. That avoids a situation where we have a whole glob of replication taking place unnecessarily. And then we also have an improved inter-site topology generator, which is going to be useful in calculating the ISTG layout for our organization. And that's what gives us the ability to use up to 3,000 sites that I talked about earlier in the Windows Server 2003 DFL. And then again, of course, I have the ability to use 5,000 or more in group membership with Windows Server 2003 interim Forest functional level. And then finally, with Windows Server 2003 FFL, I'm going to have only Windows Server 2003 domain controllers in all domains throughout the entire Forest. So all of your domains must be upgraded that way. Then I have Windows Server 2003 interim FFL, plus I get additional features such as the ability to rename domains. This might really come in handy if we had a subsidiary come along and we kind of, for a period of time, have allowed them to keep their own domain name. But later on, we want to change that domain name to something else that more accurately reflects the current ownership or the actual organization that we currently are. Well, we can do that with the domain rename. We can also have transitive forest trusts. Earlier, I showed you the example where we could create a forest trust between two root domains, between two separate forests, and all the child domains will then transitively trust that. Well, in order for that to work, we also have to have both forests in Windows Server 2003 FFL. And then we can also deactivate certain schema classes and attributes. In the past, if you create a schema class or attribute, you can just decide not to use it, but you can't make it deactivated. Now in Windows Server 2003, you can do that. In our last nugget, we took a look at a Windows NT4 domain controller and we upgraded it to Windows Server 2003 domain. And we just made it a single domain so it was the only domain in the forest. Now, there might also be situations in which I want to join an existing NT4 domain to an existing Windows Server 2003 forest. And if that's the case, then I'm going to need to go ahead and make a change to the forest. And if I'll do that, I need to change the Windows Server 2003 to the Windows Server 2003 interim forest functional level. Now, after I do that, then when I upgrade my other NT4 domains into that forest, they will automatically become Windows Server 2003 interim domain functional level. And the domain that I currently have, that's a Windows Server 2003 domain, will also automatically become an interim functional level. Now, unlike a lot of the other domain or forest functional levels from within Windows Server 2003 that you can upgrade from within Active Directory users and computers for the DFL or Active Directory domains and trusts for both the DFL and the FFL, this you cannot do just by the interface. For example, right-clicking here to raise the forest functional level, I cannot raise it to Windows Server 2003 interim forest functional level. Now, in the case of this message, it's giving me another reason for not being able to raise the forest functional level, and that's because the domain is at the Windows 2000 mixed functional level, and I cannot raise it any higher than it currently is, given that current situation. So if I right-click on the domain, then I can choose Raise Domain Functional Level, and I can go from a Windows 2000 mix to a native. But notice that there is no Windows Server 2003 interim functional level for either the forest or the domain functional level here. So there's no way I can do that from within those tools. What I need to do is to go to a tool called adsiedit.msc, and having gone here now, I need to go down to the configuration naming context, to cn equals configuration followed by the name of the domain at the root of the forest. And then once I've gotten into this, I'll expand this out a little bit, we'll need to go on down and go down to the partitions, and then we'll right-click here and choose Properties. Now the thing we're going to be looking for here is actually that's not right, is it? Oh yeah, MSDS, and we're looking for MSDS behavior version. There it is. Now what I need to do in order to make this an interim functional level is to change this value to 1, and this is not reversible, so I need to go ahead and make sure that this is exactly what I want to do. So once I'm sure that's what I want, I'll go ahead and click OK, and there we go. We're going to be at the Windows Server 2003 interim functional level. Let's go ahead and confirm that by returning to Active Directory Domains and Trusts here from the Administrative Tools on the Start menu. Right-click on Active Directory Domains and Trusts, raise Forest Functional Level. We see that it is now at the interim forest functional level. Now we'll also see that the domain itself has been raised from Windows Server 2003 mixed functional level, domain functional level, to an interim functional level here as well. So now we have the ability to have only NT4 and Windows Server 2003 domain controllers, not only in the domain, but also in the forest. Now let's take a look at another scenario here where you might have a domain called CBT Nuggets where you've worked with thousands of users, dozens of groups, and thousands of computer accounts. You got everything just right. On your file servers here, you got your access control list configured so that people gain access to the resources just the way they're supposed to. And finally, you've got an NT4 domain that seems to actually work. However, word comes down from on high that you're not going to use the name CBT Nuggets anymore. And in fact, as long as you're changing names, they want you to upgrade and get out of the 90s here and go up to Windows Server 2003. Well, that comes up with a big problem here. How am I going to get all these user groups and computers into a different domain without having to recreate them all from scratch? Well, there are a number of different scenarios, and especially if I'm going to stay with only one domain for my company anyway, one thing you might consider doing is to never create this domain up here, nuggetlab.com. Just upgrade this one like I did in the last nugget, and then because in Windows Server 2003 you can rename a domain, then once this is upgraded, then you can go ahead and just rename this domain from CBT Nuggets to nuggetlab.com. However, if you're going to be in a situation where you really do need a new namespace because of a different way your company's doing business, maybe this used to be the name of your company, but you changed it years ago, so the name of the domain is not relevant anymore. Or you want to go to this domain so that you can have other regional domains around the country. You might have a bunch of child domains over here, and you guys just want this to be at the root of your namespace. Well, again, I'm back to the situation now where I got to get these user accounts up here. And how am I going to do that? Well, I can take all of these user and computer accounts and I can migrate them up to maybe an organizational unit up here in nuggetlab.com by using a tool called admt, or the Active Directory Migration Tool. Now, this is much more advanced than the Windows 2000 version that we had. This is going to help us to retain things like our passwords. Our users won't have to memorize new passwords. You can if you want to. You can reset all the passwords if you want. But it does a lot of great new features for us, and it takes the place of what a lot of applications have done in the past that you've had to buy from third parties. Now, as is often the case with this, if you're really considering a migration scenario like this, you do probably want to at least look at third-party tools to see what they can offer you. But out of the box, admt really does a pretty good job on its own. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can migrate these NT4 accounts, CBTN user 1 and 2, as well as these group accounts down here, global groups and these local groups, how I can get those migrated into a Windows Server 2003 environment. And again, we're going to go ahead and use the tool that I mentioned to you, the Active Directory Migration Tool, which you can download from Microsoft, and there's a simple setup with it. Once you've installed it, it'll now appear on the administrative tools as the Active Directory Migration Tool, or just ADMT as we usually call it. Now, as much as I might like to use this tool, I can't do it quite yet because I'm going to need to use the SID history potentially for this, as well as other features. And since I'm at the Windows Server 2003 Mixed DFL, that does not allow for the SID history. The only levels that allow for it are Windows 2000 Native or Windows Server 2003 DFL. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to change to Active Directory Domains and Trusts here, or Users and Computers, doesn't matter. But right-click on the domain and choose Raise Domain Functional Level. Now, since I'm already at Windows Server 2003 Mixed DFL, I can't go to Windows 2000 Native DFL. However, I can raise it to Windows Server 2003 DFL, as you see here. Real simple. Again, make sure that you're ready to do this. You can't have any more NT4 domain controllers in the mix when I'm ready to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and raise it to Windows Server 2003. Again, there's the big warning saying that it can't be reversed. That's gone ahead and done its job now, so I'm finished with that. And at this point, I'm now ready to use the Active Directory Migration Tool to migrate over users, groups, computers, whatever I need. So now I'm ready to go ahead and migrate some accounts over, so I'll simply right-click up there on the Active Directory Migration Tool and choose User Account Migration Wizard, which starts this handy little wizard for me. Now, if any of the domains that are on my network have announced themselves in the browse list, then what I will be able to do is to pick them from a list here. But before we get to that stage, it asks me if I want to test the migration settings and migrate later or migrate now. Of course, this is the most prudent way to go. You just want to test it all out, see if you're going to have any nasty collisions or if anything's going to blow up on you before you actually do the migration. So we'll test it for now, and then we'll go ahead and click on Next. And here's where any domains that appear in a browse list will be visible. cbtnuggets.com has been on the network for a while, so it's announced itself, as well as nuggetlab.com, which is the domain control that I'm currently on, is a domain controller for that domain. So we'll go ahead and click on Next here. Then it asks me to add source user accounts to migrate to Active Directory. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Add. And what I could do is to manually enter in each one here. That's not usually practical in large enterprises. So I usually just click on the advanced item and then just click on Find Now. And I'm going to just search against that domain for all of its user accounts. Then when it's done searching, I'll just pick and choose which accounts I want. Let's go to CBTN user 01 and 02, and I'm using Control, or you can use Shift to multi-select these accounts. I'll also bring over the trainer account here as well. So I'll just go ahead and click OK here now that I've selected the appropriate accounts, and OK again, and then we're ready to just go ahead and click on Next. Now, I'm going to identify a target organizational unit, which I've already created in advance, called CBTN for CBT Nuggets, the domain which I'm importing from. And I'll just click OK here, and it leaves an LDAP path for me there. Now then, once you click on Next, it gives you the option to choose what kind of password you want to use. You can just use complex passwords, which is going to generate complex passwords that are associated with each individual user account, and it's going to export them to a directory of your choosing in a passwords.txt file. And you can change that location as you need to. You can also make it just the same as the username, or you can migrate the passwords. Now, that looks easy, and it's not. What you have to do is you have to set things up in advance in order to be able to use this. I'm just going to point you to where to get more information about this. If you go to Help down here, and then you go to the password options, and then go down here to password migration, this is very important information you need to know about in order to migrate those settings. You need to do some things in advance on both the client, or rather on the source domain, as well as on the destination domain. For simplicity's sake, we're just going to go ahead and use complex passwords here. And I'm just going to go ahead and put those in How about the C:\\/ directory here, and just passwords.txt to make it easy. So we'll go ahead and make complex passwords and click on Next. Now here when it comes to migrating the accounts over, I can set up the target account state so that the target accounts are enabled. That would mean that they're available to be used immediately as soon as I migrate them. Disabled, that might be useful if I'm in a gradual transitional state where I still want the users to log on to NT4 domain controllers. I've just migrated the accounts over just to see if they come over okay. And then after a couple of days or so, maybe we'll enable those accounts. So we could just disable them for now, just make sure everything comes over all right. Then we could make the target the same as the source. If they're disabled in the source, then they'll be disabled in the target, for example. Let's go ahead and enable the target accounts. Now, as far as the source disabling options, you see I'm going to be taking these accounts from an NT4 domain. Do I want to disable those source accounts? That's what I might do if I'm pretty much planning on it. You know, if it's Saturday afternoon and no one's in the office, I pretty much plan on migrating them all over there. And then when people log in on Monday, I don't want them to use the NT4 domain accounts anymore. So I would disable those source accounts. Or if I want to be more gradual about it, I could give it a certain number of days until those accounts expire. That gives us a little bit of buffer time in terms of decommissioning our NT4 domain controllers and the like. In my case, I'll just go ahead and immediately disable the accounts. And then we can also migrate the SIDs to the target domain. This relates to the SID history that I was talking to you about earlier. And this then will allow us to continue to use resources in the previous domain because we'll have an old SID in our SID history attribute in addition to the new SID from when the account is migrated over. So then we'll go ahead and click on Next. And we see a brief message here that says auditing is not enabled on the source domain. If I don't enable auditing, then SID migration will be disabled. And that's just a fail-safe so that if something goes wrong with this migration process, we want to know what happened. So we'll go ahead and enable auditing on the source domain, which in this case was the cbtnuggets.com, rather the cbtnuggets NT4 domain. Likewise, I need to also enable auditing on the target domain, which is my new nuggetlab.com domain. So I'll go ahead and say yes to that one as well. Now, this one looks kind of baffling. The local group, cbtnuggets, $, $, does not exist, blah, blah, blah. What in the world is that about? Well, you see, I just turned on auditing. And in order to work with auditing, I have to have something to audit. So this is going to be used in the auditing process. Otherwise, there's nothing to keep track of. So we'll go ahead and click on yes to create that account so that auditing can take place against it. And then here we have an option to, or actually a requirement if we're going to use SID migration, to create a registry key for TCP/IP client support. Now what this is going to do is it's going to go to HKey local machine system current control set control LSA, and it's going to modify a registry entry called TCP/IP client support, and it's going to set the data value there to 1. It's a D-word value. And once this registry change has been made over there, you have to restart that computer. Now, these things that I'm doing here, the auditing, the creation of the $, account, this registry change, I can do all that manually before I even run this wizard, and that way I won't get these prompts. But I might as well let the wizard do it for me. That way I don't have to introduce any potential of human error in this. So I'll just click on yes. And then, of course, as I mentioned, I have to reboot that domain controller. So yes, I'm going to choose yes to reboot that domain controller. And then out of the corner of my eye, I'm going to keep an eye on it and see when it comes back up, and then I'm going to go ahead and continue from there. Now that that machine is rebooted, I'm going to go ahead and enter in the credentials of someone over on that other domain that has the administrative rights on the source domain. Now I'm going to train our account over there as well as over here on this target domain, so I'll just go ahead and enter that information. Now here we have the opportunity to translate the roaming profiles, so we can copy those over. That way users can have a consistent desktop environment. We can also update the user rights so that if a user had a certain given right over in the NT4 domain from which we're migrating, they'll have the same user right when we migrate them to Windows Server 2003. We can migrate associated user groups. This is real handy, and I'm going to go ahead and do that because if I have any users that I'm migrating over that are already members of a group in that NT4 domain, then that group will also be migrated over, and I don't have to, as a second step, migrate the groups separately. Now, once I've selected this option, I can also update previously migrated objects, which is not really relevant in our case. It only has an issue if you've already used this tool at some time in the past to migrate some accounts over, to migrate a group over, and then now that you're bringing over some other additional users, then you can just update the membership of those groups. And then this is very similar. Fixed users group memberships will allow you then to add migrated user accounts to the groups in the target domain if they were members of that group in the source domain in the first place. Now I can also choose not to rename the accounts, but on the other hand, if I want to easily identify them as having come from a different location, I can give them a prefix or a suffix. I just might tack on to the beginning CBT, T, N, dash, and then it would be whatever the name of the user or group is, in this case, users. I'm not going to rename the accounts. There's no need for that in our particular case. Now, if an account that we're trying to migrate over from the source domain already has another account by that same name in the target, then we're going to have a collision. Now, the default action here is to just ignore those conflicting accounts and do not migrate them over, but you could also replace the conflicting accounts and remove the existing user rights, or you could remove existing members of the groups being replaced, or move replaced accounts to a specified target OU. And this might be something like an overflow OU of some kind, or a conflict OU, and you might name it something accordingly, so that you can have kind of a container that's dedicated to those problem accounts. What I'll typically do is I'll just rename those accounts, and I'll give them a prefix or a suffix here. So I might give it the name conflict as a prefix, and then followed by whatever the name of that account is. That way it's easily identified. We'll go ahead and click on next. Oops, I guess I added too many characters there. I'll just give it a CONF, and then we'll go ahead and click on next. Now, at this point, the wizard's pretty much done. All it's going to do here is tell me what it's about to do. It's going to tell me its 3 accounts are selected for migration, all of this summary of all the different things I've chosen to do. Wouldn't hurt to go through that to double check it. In this case, again, it's just going to be a test. It's not going to actually migrate those accounts over. I'll go ahead and click on Finish. And at this point, it's going to go ahead and start doing the migration, at least kind of in a test scenario. Now we see that it's taken 3 user accounts, examined them, copied them, no errors. 2 groups, because remember I had users that were in members of groups, and then I had a group nested inside of another group, so both of those groups had to come over as well. And I didn't migrate any computer accounts over. Now this is also kind of strange because it says completed with errors, but there were no errors. So I don't know if that's just kind of a buggy thing or whatever. You can also view the log if you need to. In our case, it looked like everything worked just fine, so we'll go ahead and close up the wizard. And actually offline here, I went ahead and took a look at the migration log here, and you can see that's located in Program Files, Active Directory Migration Tool, and Logs. Now here's the log that from what you just saw me run when I ran through that wizard. Here's another log which I'll explain in a minute. This migration log did actually show an error, and if I had been patient enough to let that screen stay on the screen for a little while longer, it would have shown an error in the far right column. I just clicked on Close too soon. In any case, down here it tells you what the error is. It cannot add the administrator account to the conflicting name of the domain, which is CONF domain admins. That's a group account that it attempted to migrate over. And the reason why is because the trainer account, which it also was migrating over, was a member of domain admins in the source domain. So that was an issue there. But it did go ahead and bring over a conflicting name of the domain admins account. And then down here we also see that admt does not process built-in accounts or change the membership of built-in accounts, such as the administrators group. Now, the trainer account that I was attempting to migrate over was also a member of the administrators account. admt does not fiddle with those built-in accounts, and that's why we had an error message there. In this case, actually, that'll be just fine because I can make that user account a member of the appropriate groups in the destination domain. And then when I went ahead and actually ran the migration, that was recorded in migration0001.log, and that just gave me, it says an error here, really not an error, it just tells me what it did. It renamed the user principal name for CONF-trainer because it can't create a UPN name with the same UPN name as something that's already in the enterprise. And I've already got a name called trainer@nuggetlab.com. Now here, real simply, I've just gone ahead and, again, I did this offline. It's the same steps in the wizard. I just chose a different choice in the first part of the wizard where instead of testing, I actually did the migration. And we see that CBT Global came over, the user 01, the user 02. We have our conflicting domain admin security group, again, because there's already a domain admin security group in this destination target domain, so I had to rename that as a conflicting name. And then there was also conflict with the trainer account because I've already got one of those accounts here as well. If we go to the account tab, we see that it also renamed the trainer user principal name from trainer to trainer0@nuggetlab.com. Now, again, to avoid any conflicts. In this nugget, we discussed the functional levels for Windows Server 2003 and a migration scenario. We talked about domain functional level and forest functional level because they have some relevance in terms of how you migrate from Windows NT 4 domains to Windows Server 2003 domains, particularly if you're migrating user accounts over, for example. Now, when it comes to Active Directory Migration Tool, we saw that you can do a number of different things with that, including transfer over the passwords. Of course, there's some additional setup that's required for that. And you can also do additional useful things, such as disabling the user accounts in the source domain so that you only have one valid copy of the account, so to speak. And also the ADMT can migrate over profiles as well. By the way, if you do need more profile help and you have a large quantity of profiles to migrate over, go ahead and take a look at another tool called the User State Migration tool, and that's very useful for migrating large quantities of profiles. And that user state migration tool can be found in the Windows Server 2003 source files. And if you look at that, you'll be able to find them under Value Add, Microsoft, and then USMT. And then here are all the associated files with the user state migration tool. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.